All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Robbie Richardson. I'm the president of the U.S. Society for Ecological Economics. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar. It's great to see that there is such interest in the topic, and we're looking forward to hearing from Eric Kemp-Benedict about the Green New Deal and what is a reasonable realism in the face of an existential threat. Before I turn it over to Eric, I will remind you of the instructions that you might find in the chat box, which we'd like to just ask you to mute yourself using the small red microphone next to your name so that we can minimize background noise. We'll turn it over to Eric soon. And then in the final 20 minutes of the discussion, you can unmute yourself to ask a question, or you're also welcome to type your question into the chat box, and I'll read it aloud to Eric. I'd like to introduce Eric Kemp-Benedict, who's a senior scientist at the Stockholm Environment Institute and a member of the United States Society for Ecological Economics. Eric studies the macroeconomic sustainability transition. He joined SEI in 1997, and he's contributed to scenario modeling studies on diverse topics of relevance to sustainability at national, regional, and global levels. Eric has led SEI's Rethinking Development theme during 2011 and 2012, and he was director of SEI's Asia Center from 2013 until 2016. He's a member of SEI's Global Research Committee. Eric holds a BS in physics from the University of Texas in Austin and a PhD in theoretical physics from Boston University, as well as MAT in secondary physics education from Tufts University. It's a great pleasure to welcome Eric Kemp-Benedict to the U.S. Society for Ecological Economics webinar series. And at this point, I will turn things over to Eric. Eric, I think you're muted. So, oh no, there you are. You're unmuted. So you may back from the beginning because we didn't hear the first part.
You're still muted.
There we go.
Now you're back.
Excellent. Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. So hello, everyone. I'd like to share a few thoughts on the Green New Deal resolution as proposed by Representative Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Markey. But first, I want to give some context. In high-income countries, the generation that is most likely to be the first to be significantly impacted by climate change is coming of age. That includes Representative Ocasio-Cortez herself, as well as the Swedish activist Greta Thunberg, but there's many others. I would like to point out that outside of high-income countries, I mean, they're very prominent now, but outside of high-income countries, impacts have been felt for some time, and they are continuing. So while I focus on the Green New Deal resolution and its list of frontline and vulnerable communities, I just want to note the much larger population of frontline and vulnerable communities beyond U.S. borders. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the resolution itself. I'm going to approach this as in my role as a member of a Research for Policy nonprofit institute, the Stockholm Environment Institute. And from that perspective, unlike, say, Governor Inslee's climate policy plan, the Green New Deal resolution is a political document and not a policy document. That is, it's meant to mobilize action and mobilize support and not to lay out a specific plan for what the government can do to support societal goals. That's not a criticism. Political documents are needed. It's just a clarifying statement. And so that's how I'm going to be approaching it. So the Green New Deal resolution has broadly two blocks, as any of these resolutions do, some whereas clauses that give the motivation, and the resolve clauses giving some definitions in what is proposed. And the whereas clauses, I mean, you can quibble with the way that I've identified these, but The whereas clauses cite the IPCC's special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius and the historical responsibility of the US for greenhouse gas emissions. So I broadly call that the science. And then it goes into social and ecological diagnosis of some ills in the US, and then moves on to the key analogy, the historical example of the New Deal and the proposed solution, the unique opportunity for a Green New Deal. Once you get inside the body of the resolution, the resolve clauses, the science is a smaller part of it. The goal, achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions. And then it focuses on the social aspects, in particular, emphasizing fairness and justice, good high-wage jobs, restoring infrastructure and industry, justice and equity, and so on. And I just want to pause for a moment to list the frontline and vulnerable communities that they identify: indigenous people, communities of color, migrant communities, deindustrialized communities, depopulated rural communities, the poor, low-income workers, women, the elderly, the unhoused, people with disabilities, and youth. Within the resolution, they also emphasize the role of populations that will be displaced in a shift away from fossil fuels. And then they go on and propose a 10-year mobilization. There's a couple of aspects to this. On the mitigation side, they identify some areas of the economy that should be fully transformed. Build resiliency against, oops, sorry, that's on the adaptation side. I just stuck it there by accident. But repair and upgrade the infrastructure in the United States. And then otherwise, fully decarbonize the power sector and buildings. And then in some hard to transform sectors, do as much as is technologically feasible: manufacturing, agriculture, and transportation. So there's not a specific target to decarbonize by the end. So those net zero emissions are presumably met through sinks and offsets, emissions reductions in other countries. On the adaptation side and some other aspects, so in addition to the resiliency mentioned on the previous slide, to mitigate and manage different impacts from pollution in general and climate change, remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere and through restoring natural ecosystems. So that's what I mean by etc. It's ecosystem-based sequestration, and then restore and protect ecosystems for biodiversity and climate resiliency. And then there are some additional actions that focus on that socio-ecological critique of challenges in the US, hazardous waste sites, other emissions and pollution, technological exchange, and so on. So here's my summary of what the resolution lays out. So one is an argument that the physical science is inescapable. Humans are changing the climate, and we can increasingly attribute specific events to climate change. The social and natural science is also compelling. The systems giving rise to climate change are causing harm to people and ecosystems. And then it offers a hypothesis that we can mitigate and adapt to climate change in ways that promote societal and ecological goals: protecting ecosystems, providing good jobs, achieving justice and fairness. And something that is sometimes not emphasized when people discuss this is that they distinguish between sectors that are relatively straightforward to transform and they focus on buildings and power generation, and those that are hard to transform where they don't anticipate a full transformation: manufacturing, transport, and agriculture. So the framing suggests utility of an economic analysis. And so in that case, you go and you look at the dominant economic approach. This would be the starting point for many people. William Nordhaus won the most recent Memorial Prize in memory of Alfred Nobel in economics for his work on climate economics. And the description here I'm going to give is for the single region dice model rather than his multi-regional rice model. But that's because it's one of the simplest to look at. But the combination that I'm talking about is characteristic of many climate economy models because of the research program he's kicked off. So you start with a neoclassical solo growth model. You add GHG emissions and in DICE as a multiple of potential output and climate impacts as a reduction from potential output. And you assume that abatement expenditure is not growth enhancing because it subtracts from output once you've taken off climate damage. And the remainder is consumption. You assume that people seek to optimize, so this is the standard assumption, a discounted stream of utility. I put it in quotation marks because kind of defined what is meant is defined by the equation. It basically is an increasing function of consumption that exhibits decreasing returns to scale. And then you find an optimal pathway for saving output and emissions. That's the standard approach in integrated assessment models. There have been some arguments against this approach. I'm going to focus on a handful of authors in particular who've done some kind of summary work or they're particularly key. So first, we haven't observed catastrophic climate damage in the past, so the empirical damage functions don't capture it. People who construct empirical damage functions acknowledge this, as well as the difficulty that they can't capture tipping points. It's also unrealistic to assume, this was Frank Ackerman argued for this, it's unrealistic to assume that none of the expenditure on abatement technology is productive. It's as though you're only putting scrubbers in so they don't add anything. It's not consumption, it's not adding to production, it's just pure abatement. But some could be. You can switch to a more fuel efficient way of producing and it will increase your productivity. Martin Weitzman argued that we have to think of climate damage as having a fat-tailed distribution, and he said that follows in particular because if you don't know how wide the distribution is, what its variance is, then you have to take that into account. And once you do that, even if it's well-behaved distributions that you're talking about, once you include the fact that you don't know what the variance is, then you end up with a fat-tailed distribution. And he argues then in that case, you can't use cost-benefit analysis. And he was definitely a fan of cost-benefit analysis. Even if you do use it, people argue it's problematic because it's strongly dependent on the damage function. It can lead to absurdities. There's a nice paper by Ackerman and Heinzerling on this, where they focused on the statistical value of a human life. And it optimizes average expectations, but the appropriate regret function might be asymmetric. For example, you might prioritize avoided harm over realized benefits, which means you're looking on one side of the distribution and not the mean. Consumption-dependent utility is not a good way to think about human motivation. This is an argument that's often made by ecological economists. And choosing a discount rate involves competing claims, including by parties who don't have a voice in it. And this is the thing about the generation coming of age now, such as Ocasio-Cortez and Thunberg, is that they're not happy with the choices we have made on their behalf. So I'm going to talk about this one in a bit more detail. So the social discount rate is this was the formula as derived. Sorry, I'm just blanking on its name. It's a famous model, but at any rate, I'm just blanking on it. But it doesn't matter. It was it's derived from an optimizing framework, and it consists of two pieces. The pure rate of time preference is the first term, and then another term that captures the fact that, or captures the possibility that people in the future simply have more money. Since your utility is based on consumption, if you've got more money, you can consume more, you must be happier, but it's a marginally declining benefit, and so you might then give some preference to the near term. So given discounting and cost-benefit analysis and consumption-based utility, I mean, those were criticized on the previous slide, but given that you're going to use all those, what is the proper value for the pure rate of time preference? That is simply the preference for your time period rather than that of the future. It's an ethical question, and this reminds me of the name I was trying to remember. Frank Ramsey, who was a contemporary of John Maynard Keynes, when they were at university together, derived this equation. So Frank Ramsey himself, who was a philosopher and a mathematician, said the proper answer is zero. You shouldn't privilege yourself over the future. In the Stern report, which is famously a counterpoint to Nordhaus, they argued that it was zero or very small. They allowed for a very small pure rate of time preference and the possibility that humans might become extinct in the future. Nordhaus argued that on ethical grounds that we have to use the implicit preferences that people exhibit when they choose discount rates in practice. And that leads to a fairly high pure rate of time preference. This formula can be extended to include risk in the sense of random variation with risk aversion separated from pure time preference, but the ethical question remains. So let's look at the implications of choosing different discount rates. So discount rates and damage functions are used to compute a social cost of carbon, and theory says that we should mitigate up to the point that, that the marginal cost would be equal to the social cost. The official social cost of carbon estimate in the US that is used for planning, taking global impacts into account, is $50 per ton CO2 at a fairly standard 3% per year discount rate. And the Resources for the Future has a nice explainer on this. For a round trip flight from Boston to London, that would amount to about $80, looking at the CO2 emissions associated with that in economy. So if the flight is $1,300, that's 6% of the cost, less than typical airport taxes and fees, and not really stopping anyone from traveling. If instead you were to allow for extreme damages with a modified damage function and a Stern-type discount rate of 1.5% per year, the social cost of carbon is about $900 per ton CO2. This was a calculation done by Frank Ackerman and his colleague Liz Stanton. That gives a total of $1,400 for the flight, more than 100% of the cost, and definitely more than the upgrade to first class. So that could actually prove to be a barrier. The result has been a political tussle over damage functions, discount rates in the SEC, and unsurprisingly, modest discount rates and damage functions have prevailed when you get down to brass tacks. So we are not setting these prices at a level that really stops people from such things as transatlantic travel. An alternative is to take the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the negotiations and the different COPs, including Paris, seriously and start with a climate target. At Paris, the aspirational target was a high likelihood of remaining below 1.5 degrees C. Celsius. Acknowledge that countries have different historical responsibilities and current capacities. That's part of the UNFCCC. That's part of the language. Acknowledge the characteristics of different countries. There's going to be existing capital stock that might be difficult to replace, different potential for saving depending on the income level, ability to secure international funding, and so on and so forth. And given all that, seek socially acceptable, technologically feasible, and ecologically and economically viable strategies to meet the climate challenge. And this is a research program, and it's not just my research program. It's there's a lot of people working from this angle. I mean, a lot. You can have several sessions in a conference on it. And it's not a single model. I'm going to present a single model in this presentation, but I myself have several addressing different aspects of this challenge, and there are other people working on this as well. So I would say you can treat this more as an invitation, unless you're one of those already working on it, in which case, hello. So the one I'm going to share is an educational mitigation model rather than adaptation. It's one presented in this Global Development and Environment Institute educational module. These are available free for download, so you can have it for the low price of $0. There are a lot of modules. The link is here on the bottom of the page. This particular one is called Green Macroeconomics, Growth and Distribution in a Finite World. And so the approach here is to start with a classical rather than a neoclassical growth model. The reason is for pedagogical clarity. They're comparatively simple models focusing, there's a lot on the accounting, and then the behavioral rules are somewhat simple. Then add greenhouse gas emissions as a multiple of the capital stock. Close the goods market, that is, set savings equal to investment in a closed economy through forced saving, and then allow consumption to adjust. And then in a scenario exercise, explore some alternatives. This is the basic approach. Start with three well-known equations for GDP. Consumption plus investment goods is the production side. On the expenditure side, you've got GDP is consumption plus saving. And therefore, in this closed economy with no government sector, investment is equal to saving. It's also equal to factor payments or income, wages plus profits. And if you normalize by dividing by GDP by Y, then the wage share plus the profit share is equal to 1. And I'm not going to make much use of this, but I'm going to use distribution from time to time. Now, in this approach, I'm taking a non-neoclassical perspective. I already mentioned classical economics. Now I'm going to switch over to some post-Keynesian economics, and Nicholas Kaldor, who was a prominent post-Keynesian, and he wrote a paper in which he argued that you could see some stylized facts in history. They include, among other things, increasing labor productivity and a steady capital output ratio, or capital productivity. And just to check whether this holds in the US, at least as a reasonable estimation, I showed data from the Penn World Tables version 9.0. It's since been updated, but reasonable is you can see labor productivity rising and capital productivity relatively flat. If you just don't so these don't hold for all time, and it's important to look at what theory can say about how they might change, and so that's some of the research that I've done. So This is a picture where I worked on that. There's a bit of noise, so if everyone could mute, that would be great. Thanks.
This is 30%. Yeah, so I'm just going to use a headset instead of speakers.
Okay. So capital is then in this model. Capital is, oh, and thank you very much for muting. Capital is added through new investments and removed through depreciation, very standard. Following Kaldor's stylized facts, I'm assuming a constant capital productivity, and therefore economic growth, GDP growth, is the same as the growth rate of the capital stock with the constant capital productivity. And so simply rearranging this, this formula, you end up with growth of the capital stock is the investment rate with respect to capital less the depreciation rate. And then GHG emissions, I'm going to make as a multiple of the capital stock. So the idea is that that capital has associated with it some level of emissions when it is put in operation. So, and in this classical model, like other classical models, I'm assuming full or normal levels of utilization of capital. And so when you run capital at its normal level, it has associated emissions. With respect to the capital stock, the emissions intensity has been falling more or less steadily in the US since the 1980s, basically towards the end of the second oil crisis. And you can see, kind of getting ready for the oil crisis because it was flat. Emissions were not changing from 1960 to the early 70s. And then you can see the disruptions of the oil crises, and then it starts to decline. And we're going to use that number and use this idea that emissions are associated with the capital stock by doing some greenhouse gas accounting. So this, from here, it's going to get kind of intense on the algebra. If that's not your thing, we'll come out of the algebra later, and I'll try to explain things as clearly as possible. So here, the emissions in the next period are the current emissions less reductions on the intensive margin. So that means using existing capital with lower emissions. For example, packing more people onto an airplane, or switching to biodiesel in a truck that can handle it, or 50% biodiesel. Inflating your tires, turning off lights, things like that. Then you have emissions associated with new capital as the average, which I express as the average gamma, less reductions, a fraction reduction on the extensive margin. So these are the emissions associated with new capital. And the emissions associated with retired capital, since the emissions intensity has been falling, are going to be higher than the average. So I express it as 1 plus a term multiplied by the average for retired capital. And I skip a lot of steps here and wave my hands, but substitute, so G is equal to this gamma, which varies with, can vary with time, times the capital stock. So substitute that, reorder the terms, and neglect second order terms in the growth rate, and then rearrange to find this. So this is how in this model, how the greenhouse gas intensity with respect to the capital stock varies in terms of these parameters. So all of this is an accounting relationship, basically. If you give me the growth rate and the depreciation rate and these factors, then this is how the intensity falls. So now we need to estimate some parameters. So first assume that reductions at the extensive margin have been steady in the past. So over that period where the average decline was about 1.9%, that's, from 1980 up to about 2014. So, it's a significant chunk of time, about 3 decades, a little over. And take the typical lifetime of capital as the inverse of the depreciation rate, then the emissions intensity of retired capital relative to new capital is whatever that reduction was to the time period that it took to go from history to the present day. So, using historical factors, okay, I've got an expression for the emissions intensity of retired capital as a multiple of the average, and of new capital as a multiple of the average, and so those factors appear here. The average cancels out. And we can then say, bringing the equation forward from the previous slide, and I'll just go back to that previous slide. This one here, so the growth rate of the emissions intensity, it's been falling at 1.9% per year, and so we get this expression right here. And you can see that we've substituted for phi r, this factor for retired capital, in terms of the reduction at the extensive margin. And then there's this additional term at the intensive margin. So we've got 2 unknown variables here. We have historical data on the growth rate and the depreciation rate. On average, those have been, I'm going to use these figures. They change over time, but these are pretty reasonable. A bit over 2% per year and depreciation rate of nearly 5% per year. And given that, and using Excel solver, if the reduction at the intensive margin is 0%, historically the reduction at the extensive margin is 1.6% in this model, and the ratio for retired capital is 38%, and so on. For illustrative purposes, I am going to use these figures. So, in the equation above, historically, I'm going to assume a reduction at the intensive margin of 0.5%, and therefore, so this just comes from the calculation, the historical reduction at the extensive margin is 1.2%, and the relative value for retired capital is 28% higher than it is today. Okay. And now, with these numbers, we can do a bit of policy analysis. So the Green New Deal resolution is calling for carbon neutrality after a 10-year mobilization. But as I pointed out, only a couple of sectors are supposed to fully decarbonize. Others do not. The model that I developed above, and again, it's an educational model. It's not a serious policy model. But it doesn't include carbon sinks or offsets, and so I'm just going to assume that that for actual reduction in emissions through capital turnover and changing the way we operate capital, we're aiming for an 80% reduction over 10 years. Assuming that starts somewhere in the middle of the next president's term, that would take us up to 2032. So using our model, we're saying the emissions 10 years after the start, so that's the gamma plus 10, K plus 10, over gamma K at the start in 2022, say, is equal to, and this is the expression in brackets is the one that I showed before. The 1 plus G is because the capital stock is growing at that rate. So you've got a reduction in intensity, emissions intensity, multiplied by the growth rate of the capital stock to the power of 10 years. And at the end of all that time, the emissions have to be 20% of what they were at the start. That's what that equation says. Rearranging, we can find an expression for what we have to accomplish at the extensive margin. When we introduce new capital, how much lower must the greenhouse gas emissions be than they are today? And here are some illustrative calculations. So use our estimate for the relative emissions for retired capital way back when. Assume the same growth rate and depreciation rate I assumed before. And you find that you have to have emissions at the intensive margin, that is things like retrofitting and packing more people in a plane, running engines more efficiently and so on, has to be at least 8.5%. But the dependence is pretty steep. So if you get 10% reductions at the intensive margin, then you find that phi x, the reduction at the extensive margin, has to be 78% for new capital, which is way higher than what we estimated for historically, but it is not unprecedented. More than half, globally, more than half of new electricity generation is from renewable sources, or it has been in recent years. So it's not impossible to do. But it would be a distinct break from the past. To make it a little bit easier, it's possible to retire capital early. And this was the idea for the CARS program, which was nicknamed Cash for Clunkers, where older cars were purchased and people were given cash, but they were required to purchase a more efficient new car. If you were to retire an additional 2% of the capital stock each year and therefore effectively increase the depreciation rate, then if you get 10% reductions at the intensive margin, then only about half of new capital has to be zero emissions. Some initial comments here. Made no assumption about changes in consumer behavior. Assumed a constant capital productivity, but while that is an historical regularity, it's not a law, and so there's some theory about how that might change. But it does emphasize the importance of long-lived capital stocks, and this is something that people have been warning about since at least '97 and probably before, that we really have to get going on replacing our carbon-intensive capital stocks if we want to make headway on this. We have not done that very much, and so we're now in a crisis mode. Improvements at the intensive margin and early retirement reduce the need to replace capital. But either way, when we replace capital, a lot of it has to be low carbon because of those existing long-lived capital stocks. To bring the average down, when we add new capital, it has to have a much lower level of greenhouse gas emissions. I would also point out that the intensive and extensive emissions reductions have to be technologically possible, and eventually that's going to be limited by thermodynamics, but my reading, the sense from the authors of the Green New Deal resolution is that there's a lot of room to improve. I suspect that that's true, but that's an area of research as well. But looking over this, it's kind of starting to look like the Green New Deal resolution. I want to say a couple of things here about productive and non-productive investment. So the investment rate per unit of now includes enough productive capital to expand output at the target rate, the replacement of depreciated capital, replacement of capital that's been retired early, if you're going to grow, and pure mitigation, non-productive investment expenditure, and I assume that that increases with level of effort. Unlike Nordhaus, I'm not assuming that none of that investment is productive, but there will be some non-productive expenditure. From GDP accounting, GDP is consumption plus investment, so consumption is GDP minus investment. And therefore, once you substitute, you find that consumption over GDP is 1 minus a term that is, this is the normal consumption share of GDP. That's what you get without any extraordinary effort. And then there's an additional reduction in your consumption that I'm assuming comes from something called forced saving. And I'm running out of time, but I'm gonna finish my slides. I'll try not to go too far over the 40 minutes. What about price adjustment? Just, you know, that's what people are used to. That's the main mechanism in neoclassical models. While forced saving is ignored, you can expect both, as well as some other mechanisms. So for a proper policy model, I mean, I think this is a compelling mechanism for the following reason. That forced saving is basically what happened during World War II. So people, this is the parallel with the New Deal. So it brought people into the workforce, and wartime mobilization drew extraordinary saving from a fully employed workforce. So that's kind of what we're talking about here. Proper policy analysis would need several mechanisms that might compete. After that wartime mobilization, at the end of the war, people had a lot of savings, and it powered a boom. But this is a major focus of the Green New Deal, is that it was inequitably distributed, either explicitly or de facto. And we have to be aware that in this case, a boom goes counter to the goals of reducing emissions, and that is not explicitly in the Green New Deal text. I want to say a little bit now about all that language about trust and justice in the Green New Deal, which has sometimes been said to be a laundry list or extraneous, or why are you distracting us with this, and so on. Summarizing what has come before in this presentation, we just scratched the surface with the model. There's a lot more to do in this area, and there's a lot of other work going on. But it suggests that there will be a major turnover in capital and new behaviors, a socio-technological revolution, and that's a technical term. There's a literature on that. But unlike previous such revolutions, it's going to be done intentionally, and it requires a change in the material basis of our economy. It's a massive transformation, and we suspect but don't know what technologies will succeed. And that means we have to undertake collective action in the face of uncertainty. Collective action, the literature on collective action, argues that it requires what's called generalized trust, social trust, allowing strangers to undertake consequential actions for you on your behalf, and institutional trust, relying on institutions and norms to align those strangers' actions with your expectations. This is how we get things done together, but it raises at least two problems. Both forms of trust are, for many U.S. residents, at historically low levels. For some U.S. residents, it's kind of at the same level it's been for a long time. But even if it weren't true, trust requires experience, and we're talking about stepping into the unknown. How do you build up experience? And in that case, there is a literature, less extensive than the one on trust, about fairness. That fairness, and this is a hypothesis of myself and my colleague Shivan Kartha, that fairness is a value that can form the basis of trust in a disruptive transition. Judgments will vary from person to person, but there are systematic patterns that we can understand and anticipate. And this is where the existing literature comes in. It says when information on the outcome of some process is limited, people will substitute judgments about the fairness of the process rather than when they can't observe actual outcomes. And for the Green New Deal, that suggests that fairness and justice can play a functional role as well as a normative role. So my feeling is that that is not extraneous, not just a laundry list, that it's central to success. So conclusions, seriously addressing climate change will transform our economies and societies. It will likely place strains on them, but it can be managed possibly if it's broadly seen as fair and just. The fundamental parameters are provided by physics and biology, which is often summarized as the science. There are also economic constraints. There's basic economic accounts and the need to replace capital stocks and so on. But there's a lot of economic degrees of freedom. A crucial question is what is technologically possible, but there are some pilots that suggest scope for emission reductions. And finally, my final point, I argue that this is a reasonable realism, these points right here, and that at least in broad outline, the Green New Deal resolution is consistent with them. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, for leading a stimulating discussion with a strong economics theoretical foundation on this political proposal that certainly captured a lot of attention. We do have 10 minutes or so for questions. Obviously, it's going to be challenging for people to speak at once. So if you do start to speak at the same time as someone else, perhaps defer, and then we'll catch you later, or also feel free to type a question into the chat box in the lower right-hand corner. Are there questions for Eric?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, Bob.
Everything here moves very fast, so there are transaction costs in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, just as there are transaction costs in economic terms. The faster we move, the bigger those are. Is that in the model? In other words, the greenhouse gas to be released when we make a solar panel?
It is not. It's that is absolutely right, that there are costs associated with the investment itself that I did not include in this model. You're right. And I take that as a modification that I will add. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Carrie?
Harry, you might be muted.
I thought I saw Carrie unmute himself.
Okay.
Jim Carpenter is unmuted. Jim, do you have a question? We're not hearing any other questions. Please, nope, I can't hear Jim.
Could you type?
You appear to be.
Will the slides be made available? I'm perfectly happy to do that.
I can email those to all the attendees as well as the recording of the presentation.
Okay, here's one. Carrie King, what are reasonable changes that could be expected for capital productivity, for example, lower capital productivity for wind, solar versus historical electricity generation? Yes. That I guess that one I'm not 100% sure of. Labor productivity has been documented that I know of, and this is part of what's behind the claim that green technologies or green investment is job creating, because for a given level of investment or a given level of physical output, you need more people. But for capital productivity, to the extent that that would be the case, that would add an additional challenge if you're trying to hit a particular GDP growth rate. If you're okay with taking a bit of a hit on the GDP growth rate and focusing on the expansion of the needed capital stock, then it won't be as challenging. But that would lead to a higher need for emissions at the margin. And then Charlie, on the issue of reasonable realism, worth noting that strong mitigation can probably be viewed as more realistic than the AU. Yeah, I hope. If you mean for continued existence.
Dale, can I be heard?
I can hear you.
Okay, Eric, you started to raise the question a minute ago, but if you go back, have you played in your model with slight reductions in expected GDP growth? And associated with that, because that might ease things a little bit, and I know a lot of the degrowth people would be interested in seeing that. And related to that, can you tell us a little bit more about the distributional aspects? You hinted at it, but it wasn't really in the rest of the presentation, and I'll mute myself now.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so two things. Yes, I have played around with degrowth. With this model, you kind of just state it, and so it makes things easier. But where we're trying to get a handle on degrowth is with a full dynamic model that includes on a time scale where you can see business cycles, and then you can see longer cycles with technological, driven by technological change. And with that, we're playing around with consumer behavior, and the most successful effort, the most successful mechanism that we found is a large scale downshifting, where people simultaneously withdraw from the workforce and reduce their consumption levels. It has to be at quite large scale, probably larger than anyone is currently considering. And in that model, we're just looking at the we're not looking at hardship in that case, which might occur. Distributionally, so actually, I kind of stepped away from that with this particular calculation because I was using a Kaldorian closure. Well, no, I wasn't. I was using a forced savings closure instead of a Kaldorian closure. So with Kaldor, if you need more saving, you have to shift income towards profits. That's Kaldor's argument. With forced saving, you assume that the saving rates can change for wage earners. Kaldor assumed they were more or less fixed, and so that's why you have to shift the distribution towards profits if you need the additional saving. In a forced saving model, you say that you encourage people to buy green bonds rather than consume. Cut down on their consumption, but put their money towards the transformation of the economy, so they're building up their savings. And so I went that route. So I basically assumed that there was no change in distribution in this case.
Thank you, Dale, for the question. We probably have time for one quick question, if there is one. Well, hearing none, I see that most people remain muted, and I don't see anything new added to the chat box. It is getting close to 2 o'clock, so I'd like to, on behalf of the U.S. Society for Ecological Economics, like to extend our warm thanks to Eric Kemp-Benedict for this stimulating discussion. I'd like to thank Aaron Lennox for helping to get the word out, and Presumably she will be able to share the slides that Eric has provided with those who are interested, and certainly hope that people will get in touch with Eric if they have additional questions. Thank you all for your participation.
Thank you. And I will just put I think it was there before, but I forgot to put my email in the chat box. So there it is. If anybody wants to copy it quickly before we sign off.
That's great. Thank you. That's very helpful. Thanks again for taking time to share your insights with us.
Thank you very much.
All the best.
Okay. Bye, everyone. Bye.